Hi, this is Dr. Chandler, and this is the responding to project risks project scenario. And we're using the same project case study that I have been using in the entire project risk management series. And in this one, we are addressing two aspects of the responses: the identifying and planning, selecting the response, and then actually implementing the response. Both of those are addressed in this entire response to project risks course. So let's give a quick overview of the organizational environment that this project existed in. This is a professional association that had existed for a long time in Washington, D.C., and the members of this professional association were other organizations, not individual people. And the organizational units of this professional association, they didn't have a long history of cooperating and collaborating with each other. They really operated very individually. They each had their own constituency areas, the constituents that they served. They each considered that what they did was very unique to them, didn't really have much to do with what the rest of the organization was doing. A new chief information officer had just joined the organization, and that person was considered an outsider based on their professional background. They had an existing association management system that functioned well, but was really out of date from a technology perspective. It didn't work with the internet. It didn't work with mobile devices. It wasn't clickable. You had to use the characters on the keyboard. It was really old. And the organization had no project management processes in place. So the project that they embarked on had two pieces to it. One was to buy an off-the-shelf software system that was a association management system, and then begin loading their data into it and start using it and get some utility out of it right away. And at the same time, enter into a contract with the same vendor that they were buying that software from, and having some of their analysts conduct a gap analysis to identify the gaps between their existing system and the functionality the data it collected and the functionality that they had in that existing system, and the gaps between that and the new system that had just been purchased. Identify all the gaps. Then the idea was they were going to pay the vendor to program all of that functionality into this system. So they thought this would take only about a year. And there was no project management planning that had been done, and there was no risk management plan. And so what I'm covering in these videos, with these project scenario videos, is after the fact, well after the fact, if risk management processes had been done. So for planning and implementing responses to the risks that have been identified and analyzed, there's a lot that needs to be done in this area, right? And some of this work has already started during the analysis process. And so the rest of these slides, you should recognize them if you've taken the previous courses. It picks up right where we left off the last time. And we'll be addressing each of the risks that had been identified and analyzed. And we'll be addressing one of these classic project risk response strategies. And there are more than just these, but these are the classic ones. Avoid, mitigate, accept, and transfer. So avoid, this is the idea that some project risks can be avoided altogether. For example, a risk that's associated with a project where the part of the project is to use some completely new and unproven technology. That can be avoided if the project plan or the objectives get changed to enable the project to use some older, tried and true, proven technology instead. Likewise, in a risk in meeting a particularly difficult requirement can be avoided if the requirement can be eliminated or adjusted. These types of responses are immediate, and thus they can be incorporated into the project plan when they're agreed upon by all of the stakeholders. So the mitigate strategy is the most common risk response strategy that's used, risk mitigation actions. In fact, in the past, a typical practice was to refer to all risk response plans as mitigation plans. These actions are designed and implemented to either bring down the probability of the risk occurring or to lower the amount of impact that the risk would have on the project, or both, or a combination of both of those. So in a lot of situations when mitigation is the strategy that's chosen and implemented, what results is that there's still some residual risk that remains, but the idea is to pull that risk down into an acceptable range of risk, into where the risk could be accepted. So sometimes it's appropriate to simply accept the risk and not take any action at all, and that strategy can be implemented to ensure that all the stakeholders are aware and they're all in agreement that this risk is going to be accepted. And then sometimes there can be processes put in place on the project to watch out for this risk occurring. There might be some sort of response after the risk occurs. There might be some sort of planned action if that particular risk that has been accepted, that there's some actions that are going to be done after it occurs, not to try to get rid of it, but just to respond to it. And the transfer risk strategy. Risk transference requires a third-party relationship, and this is to shift the impact out so that the impact is outside of the project. It's shifting the responsibility to maybe a business partner or a supplier who has more control over the source of that risk. So the third party takes ownership of that, the response strategy, and has to have the authority and the wherewithal to deal with that particular risk. So these are the major, like I said, the classic project risk response strategies. So here we are back to our risks that were identified and then analyzed. And when we analyze them, we use the probability impact matrix, recall that, and the numbers that appear at the top of the slide indicate that which cell in the probability impact matrix that these risks fell in. And so so this one's high probability, high impact, and that fell into number 9. That's the highest that existed in that that probability impact matrix that we're using. So for these risks, the conflict between the executive stakeholders disrupting the project could have been mitigated for this particular example project. That could have been done through several approaches in an attempt to reduce that risk down to a yellow level. But the project manager, remember, was already investing an inordinate amount of time communicating with senior management. So trying to give the project manager more work to do, to go speak to all of the different stakeholders and address their individual concerns regularly, probably wouldn't have been feasible. But there might have been another strategy whereby perhaps there would have been a stakeholder besides the CIO who would have been willing to step up and facilitate more collaboration amongst all of the stakeholders. That's a possibility, and that's just one strategy that could have been a mitigating strategy to help in this area. And then the executive turnover disrupting the project, there really isn't anything the project could have done to prevent that. That just had to be accepted. But like I said, plans could have been put in place to say, okay, if that does happen, at least is the project going to continue? That could have been decided ahead of time. Who was going to step in and take over that role if the CIO had decided to leave, because there would be a long period of time for them to do a search to hire a new CIO, and so somebody would have had to been had to have taken over during that time frame, and those are things that they could have decided and put in place ahead of time. So with these actions, they could have brought these high priority, 9 category, high probability and high impact risks and pulled them down into the yellow range. That is possible. So now the next ones, they were also high probability and high impact in the 9 category. Failure to follow a project management methodology and no project management or control. So these could have been avoided. And the risks relating to having a project manager with no experience and there being no project management practices followed, those were really, could have been relatively easy to avoid, and they could have been avoided if the organization had been willing to implement the risk responses necessary to do this. So simply put, they could have, the PM that they actually selected would have had been replaced, and they would have had to bring in a project manager who had the requisite experience to lead this project, and that person would have to be trusted to bring in the project management best practices to manage the project. But this wouldn't have been too challenging to accomplish, as there was plenty of consulting firms in the Washington, D.C. area that had they had project managers with that kind of experience and knowledge that could have been hired to come in and manage the project. And the size of this project certainly warranted a project management team of at least maybe 4 people to take on different roles in a project management team, and they could have come in. And this also would have been a way of transferring some of this risk. Here, let me move the video of me there a little bit. So that, like I said, that would have been a way of transferring some of the risk too, to put a contract in place to hire an outside project management team to come in and do that. That would have been an option. Okay, now the next 9 category, high probability, high impact, was the fact that there wasn't any change management procedures or change management system or change management board. And this is related to the risks that we just covered on the previous slide. And these would have been easy to avoid if the organization had been willing to invest in putting that project management team in place. If change management processes were something that were written into the contract to hire a project management team in to implement effective change management procedures, then that's something that they could have brought over. And again, I probably should have put filled something in the transfer cell as well, because that would have been a way of transferring a great deal of this risk as well. And that would have moved that all, like as it indicated, into the green range, into the acceptable range. That would have made a big difference on this project. So the next one, high probability, medium impact, and this got a score of 8. The scope creep and the gold plating. Again, these could have been avoided by implementing the steps that were mentioned on the previous slides if a project management team that had effective change management procedures in place, and if they had come from outside the organization and come in and implemented firm procedures for holding the line and really ensuring in those gap analysis meetings and really pressing, asking those multiple questions to figure out, is this functionality that already exists, and making sure that the line was being drawn and that they weren't adding in entirely new functionality. That might have been something that having outside individuals working on that could have been more effective. All right, the communication overhead risk, that was in the category 8 as well. And again, if there was a project management team, if they're, like I said, maybe 4 individuals, the overall project manager, there could have been a project coordinator who was responsible for keeping all the various documents and project planning documents that are necessary, keeping those all updated, and keeping all the stakeholders informed of the progress and the decisions about the project. That could have helped a great deal. They could have also been in that team of 4 people. There could also have been an individual that was had some specialized experience and skills in the risk management area that could have been on that team. And then one of the individuals could have been a requirements analysis facilitator. That's another individual that could have been on the team that could have helped reduce a lot of these risks. So this was one way that they could have avoided that risk. The next high probability, medium impact one was the learning curves that existed, right? And we had talked about in the previous videos about the individuals that the vendor organization supplied as the analysts had no experience with the software that they sold, nor did they have any experience or knowledge with the data structures or the functionality of the existing system within the organization, nor did they have any experience doing gap analysis. So these individuals were enthusiastic, they were bright, they were friendly, they were willing to do whatever was necessary, but they didn't have the requisite knowledge and experience to really slot themselves in. Their learning curves were really steep. So this gap could have been mitigated. Here's another area where I guess I could have put this in the transfer cell as well, because they could have hired a small team of analysts just to do this part of the project, and so that would be another way to reduce the risk by hiring some requirements analysts who are familiar with doing these kinds of gap analysis between an existing legacy system and a new off-the-shelf system. So now we're into some category 7 risks that were identified and analyzed earlier. And this was with regards to the cost forecasting that had been done by the vendor. Remember, the vendor had a off-the-shelf system that they sold, and so their pricing and their cost models that they used within their organization to figure out how they're going to set the prices on the different products that they offered, they had a lot of experience in that, but they didn't. The kind of project that they were engaging with for this client was one-off for them. The length of it was highly unusual for them, and the depth of the analysis that needed to be done was way out of their ballpark of skills to tackle. And so there was a lot of risk around the cost estimate that they had developed. So this could have been mitigated by if some external group had done an independent cost estimate of this project. And that's something that could be a really small project that could have been done by some project cost experts, and that could have helped mitigate this risk. And at least brought it down into the yellow range. All right, another 7 medium probability, high impact, and this is with regards to the stakeholders. Now, if you recall this, there was a long list of these risks. I truncated it and condensed it down, and I've just called it stakeholder problems there. But these could have been mitigated if that 4-person project management team that I mentioned had been hired and had been allowed to follow project management best practices, which would have included a communication plan, not only to keep the stakeholders informed, but would have also have allowed the stakeholders to trust the this project management team, what they were doing. So there would have been a interrelated actions going on there where the stakeholders would, if they had a higher level of trust or belief that the project was going to be successful, that would have fed into a lot of these kinds of risks, and their support for the project could have been maintained at a higher level. So another 7 medium probability high impact risk that we identified previously and analyzed was about the design. And again, I compacted these. It was a long list, and I've kind of truncated it and shortened it. And these could have been mitigated, I think. Recall that no one in the vendor organization really understood that the data relationships that served the existing system were very different from the ones that were in the system that the vendor was selling. So because those underlying designs were so drastically different, the gaps that were being identified in those gap analysis meetings were not just a functionality gap, they were a really fundamental kind of design difference. And so it's possible that these issues could have been mitigated if there had been a small pilot project before the full-blown let's replace the entire system. If a small area of functionality had been identified to segment out and then they had actually made the data structure changes necessary, and then load some of the data from the existing system into there, and then go ahead and enhance a little bit of the functionality just to test out on a small scale, to pilot out whether this was going to work or not. That could have demonstrated the feasibility of it. It could have uncovered these deeper design issues, and that also related to a couple of the risk slides that we just addressed before this one. That also could have addressed those ideas of the stakeholder commitment as well, because if we had done a pilot, like a proof of concept pilot at the very beginning of this, that would have addressed a lot of those kinds of concerns as well. So another 7 medium probability high impact, and this has to do with the users. The risks that were associated with the user acceptance problems, those again are very much related to several of the things that we've already discussed. And again, I think that these could have been mitigated if we had done a proof of concept pilot. I think that having that, and also having that project management team, having that competence there, and using project management best practices, and implementing some change control procedures, and hiring some experienced and competent gap analysis, and having that proof of concept pilot, I think all of those things all together would have interacted and would have helped mitigate a lot of these user acceptance problems. So I've gone through these rather quickly, and there actually were a couple of lists that I didn't include in this review. The risk response alternatives that I would have suggested were probably very similar, and you notice a lot of them did fall in the mitigate area. But implementing risk responses, there's a delicate balance that one has to achieve when implementing the chosen risk response while the project is underway. As you can tell, some of them that we discussed for this particular project would have had to have been implemented before the project got underway. But trying to implement them while the project has already started, that can be really challenging at times. And obviously some of the risk responses mentioned in this presentation would have impacted the subsequent risk identification, right? So if we had this, then if this had been placed before the project started, then the actual risks identified for the project would have been quite different. So there's an interrelatedness amongst the risks that adds some complexity when trying to implement various risk responses, because sometimes this risk response might be chosen to deal with this risk, but that risk is related to this one over here as well. So keep in mind that the overall goal obviously is to reduce the risks to an acceptable level so the project can continue. And there needs to be decisions made ahead of time. This is what project risk management is all about, is making those decisions ahead of time. When the risks are too high, then the project will be canceled. Making those decisions ahead of time removes a lot of the emotionality out of that decision-making process, and it allows project decision makers to reach the conclusion that a project needs to be canceled much more quickly, and that means that fewer resources are being invested in a project that's just going to be truncated and ended. So making that decision as quickly as possible is more beneficial to the organization overall. So there's also the ongoing process of tracking these risk responses when they're going in place, and then circling back around to the overall project plan and integrating where those actions fit in. But at all times, the idea is that the risk identification is something that doesn't just get done at the beginning of the project. That's always getting done. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the last class of this series. Thank you.